What if your body was not your own? I don't mean that in a philosophical sense. I mean it literally. What if the blood in your veins, the flesh on your bones, and most terrifyingly of all, the sacred, life-giving space of your womb, were the legal property of a nation? What if your ability to bear a child, or your failure to do so, could decide the fate of thousands, erase a country from the map, and rewrite history itself? This isn't a dystopian novel. This isn't a far-flung fantasy. This was the lived, breathed, and agonizing reality for a girl who became a duchess, and a duchess who became a queen. Twice. Her name was Anne of Brittany, and her body was a battlefield. Imagine being 14 years old. You are not just any girl. You are the ruler of a proud, ancient land, the Duchy of Brittany. Your father has just died, and his last breath has placed a crown on your head and a target on your back. The most powerful king in Europe, the King of France, sees your land not as a neighbor, but as a prize. His armies are at your borders. His spies are in your court, and his ambition is singular to swallow your nation whole. He doesn't just want your castles and your ports. He wants the ultimate guarantee. He wants you. He forces you into a marriage that is less a holy sacrament and more a political annexation. You become his wife, the Queen of France. But in your heart, you are a prisoner in a golden cage. But the true horror, the masterstroke of this political chess game, was not the forced marriage itself. It was a single, brutal clause written into the marriage treaty, a clause inked in the language of patriarchal power and dynastic greed. It stipulated that if the king were to die without a son, you, Anne, would not be free. You would not be allowed to return to your homeland as its sovereign duchess. No. The treaty bound you, your body, and your future to the French crown itself. You would be legally obligated to marry the next king of France. Your womb was now a state asset, perpetually mortgaged to your enemy. It was a checkmate against your future, a guarantee that no matter what happened, Brittany would be absorbed. Anne of Brittany was trapped not just for one lifetime, but potentially for many. The story of Anne is not just a personal tragedy, it is the final, desperate chapter of a nation. To understand the cage she was placed in, you must first understand the precious thing she was fighting to protect the Duchy of Brittany. For centuries, Brittany was a world unto itself, perched on the western edge of France, jutting out into the Atlantic. It had its own language, its own laws, its own fiercely independent identity. The Breton people did not consider themselves French. They were Celts, kin to the Welsh and the Cornish, a remnant of an ancient world that had resisted Roman and Frankish invasions. Their dukes were sovereigns, not vassals, who played a delicate game of diplomacy, balancing the ambitions of their powerful neighbors, France and England. This fragile independence was shattered in the late 15th century. Duke Francis II, Anne's father, made a fatal miscalculation. He challenged the growing power of the French monarchy and lost. The ensuing war, known as the Mad War, devastated Brittany and ended in a humiliating treaty. A key term of this treaty was that Francis's daughters, his only heirs, could not marry without the consent of the King of France. This was the first lock on Anne's cage. When her father died from a fall from his horse in 1488, 12-year-old Anne inherited a duchy in crisis, politically weakened, financially drained, and at the mercy of a king who saw her not as a fellow ruler, but as the final piece in his puzzle of a unified France. The central conflict was now set in stone. Could one girl's will preserve a nation's soul against the crushing weight of a kingdom's ambition? The question then becomes one of profound moral and political complexity. Why was France so obsessed with possessing Brittany for King Charles VIII? It was a matter of state security and national pride. An independent Brittany could, and often did, ally with France's perennial enemy, England, providing a staging ground for invasions. To unify the realm and secure his western flank was the paramount duty of a French king. From his perspective, the marriage was a peaceful, elegant solution to a centuries-old strategic problem. But from the Breton perspective, it was cultural annihilation. It was the death of their language, the erosion of their laws, the end of their story. Anne was placed directly at the epicenter of this clash. Her duty as Duchess was to fight for Brittany's independence. Her fate as a woman in the 15th century was to be used as a bargaining chip to secure peace. Every choice she made was a betrayal of one of these sacred duties. This was the impossible paradox of her life. The first act of Anne's desperate struggle for freedom was a bold, almost reckless gamble. In 1490, to counter the looming threat of a forced French marriage, Anne and her advisors arranged a secret wedding. Her chosen groom was no less than Maximilian Theix, the King of the Romans, soon to be Holy Roman Emperor. It was a brilliant strategic move. An alliance with the powerful Habsburg Empire would create a formidable bloc against France. The marriage, however, was done by proxy. A representative of Maximilian came to Rennes, and in a bizarre but legally binding ceremony, he placed his booted leg into the ducal bed beside Anne. She was now, in the eyes of the Church and the world, the wife of the most powerful man in Christendom. She was saved, or so she thought. The French response was swift and brutal. King Charles VIII was enraged by this defiance. Declaring the proxy marriage illegal as it was done without his consent, he marched his army into Brittany. This was not a negotiation. It was a conquest, one by one. Breton towns fell. Finally, the French army laid siege to the city of Rennes, where Anne herself was holding out. For months, she held on, hoping for Maximilian's armies to arrive and save his bride. They never came. The emperor was overextended, fighting other wars on other fronts. Brittany was on its own, starving, exhausted, and with no hope of relief. Anne was forced to surrender. The price of peace was the annulment of her marriage to Maximilian and her immediate marriage to her conqueror, Charles VIII. In the winter of 1491, the 14-year-old Duchess was escorted to the Château de Langeais and became the Queen of France. The first lock of her cage had snapped shut. Her life with Charles was a tapestry woven from threads of luxury and sorrow. As Queen of France, she was draped in jewels and silks, the mistress of magnificent castles. She established a court of her own, filled with artists, poets, and her loyal Breton ladies-in-waiting. She was intelligent and cultured, and she wielded her soft power with skill, always promoting the interests of her beloved Brittany where she could. She famously had a book of hours created, the Grande Heure of Anne of Brittany, a masterpiece of illumination that depicted Breton saints, a quiet act of cultural preservation. But beneath the surface of royal splendor was a relentless, personal agony. The primary duty of a queen was to produce a male heir to secure the dynasty, and so began Anne's grueling, heartbreaking cycle of pregnancy and loss. Her body, the asset France had so coveted, became a source of profound suffering. In 1492, she gave birth to her first child, a son, Charles Orland. For a moment, there was euphoria. France had its dauphin, and Anne had done her duty. She was, by all accounts, a doting, even obsessive mother, rarely letting the child out of her sight. But in the unsanitary conditions of the 15th century, infant mortality was a merciless reaper. At the age of 3, the little Dauphin caught the measles and died. Anne was plunged into a grief so deep it was said to have physically altered her. The cycle began again. A second son was born and died on the day of his birth. A daughter was born and died at 2 years old. Another pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. Each loss was not just a mother's personal heartbreak. It was a political crisis. With every tiny coffin, the terrifying clause in her marriage treaty loomed larger. If Charles died, she would belong to his successor. Then, the unthinkable happened. In 1498, King Charles VIII, still a young man, met a bizarre and sudden end. Hurrying to watch a game of tennis, he struck his head violently on the stone lintel of a low doorway. He collapsed and died a few hours later. He left behind no sons. Anne, at 21, was a widow, and for a fleeting, glorious moment, she was free. She was once again the sovereign Duchess of Brittany. She immediately returned to her homeland, re-established her own chancellery, issued her own currency, and began to rule as the independent leader she was always meant to be. But the ink on her marriage treaty was not dry. The clause was still in effect. The French crown had passed to Charles's cousin, Louis the Duke of Orléans, who now became King Louis XIII, and the treaty demanded Anne marry him. There was just one complication. The new king, Louis XII, was already married. His wife was Jeanne de France, a woman described as pious and kind, but also physically disabled, and the daughter of Louis XV, a king Louis XIV despised. For years, Louis had been trying to rid himself of this political marriage. Now, with the ultimate prize, Anne and her Duchy of Brittany, on the table, he moved decisively. He appealed to the Pope for an annulment, using the cruel and humiliating pretext that his marriage to Jeanne had never been consummated and that she was too deformed to bear children. The Pope, seeking a French alliance, granted it. Jeanne was cast aside, sent to a convent, and became a footnote in history, another woman sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. The path was now clear. In 1499, for the second time in her young life, Anne of Brittany married the King of France. Her second marriage was different from the first. Louis XIV was older, more pragmatic, and seemed to hold a genuine affection and respect for Anne. He formally recognized her title as Duchess of Brittany and agreed that their second child, male or female, would inherit the duchy, a major concession. Anne, in turn, wielded considerable influence at court. She was a fierce protector of her Breton prerogatives and a major patron of the arts. But the fundamental, crushing pressure remained the same. She had to produce a male heir. A son born to Louis and Anne would unite the crowns of France and Brittany forever, finally fulfilling the French ambition. And so, the agonizing cycle of pregnancies continued. In 1499, she gave birth to a daughter, Claude, a healthy child, a future duchess, but not the son France demanded. Then came a miscarriage, then another, then, in 1510, another daughter, Renée. By now, Anne was in her 30s, years of near-constant pregnancy, at least 7, possibly more, had taken a devastating toll on her body. She was often ill, suffering from bone ailments, yet the pressure never ceased. The court whispered. The kingdom waited. Each month was a measure of success or failure. She fought to secure Brittany's future through her daughters, arranging a marriage for Claude, to a Habsburg prince to pull the duchy away from France. A plan Louis XXI initially agreed to, but later reneged on under pressure from French nobles. Her final years were a race against time, a political battle fought from her sickbed. She was trying to outmaneuver the very destiny that had been written for her as a child. If you were in her position, seeing your health fail while the fate of your homeland rested on your ability to produce a son you did not have, what would you have done? Would you have accepted fate? Or would you, like Anne, have fought to the very last breath? In January 1514, at the age of just 36, Anne's body finally gave out. She died from a kidney stone attack. Her will was a final act of defiance. She decreed that her heart be sent back to her homeland, to be interred in the tomb of her parents in Nantes, the capital of her duchy. Her body would be buried in France, with the French kings, but her heart, the very symbol of her love and her will, belonged to Brittany. It was a poetic, tragic gesture. She had lost the war. Her eldest daughter, Claude, was ultimately married to the man who would become the next king of France, Francis III, sealing Brittany's fate. But in her death, she made one last, powerful statement about where her true allegiance lay. She had been the Queen of France, but she died, in her heart, as the last Duchess of an independent Brittany. Anne's story, stripped of its crowns and castles, is a brutal case study in human biology under extreme duress. From a modern scientific perspective, her tragedy was programmed by three inexorable forces: the unforgiving nature of pre-modern medicine, the immense physiological strain of constant childbearing, and the crushing psychological weight of her dynastic duty. Let's first examine the stark reality of childbirth and infant mortality in the 15th century. Today, we take for granted the knowledge of germ theory, antibiotics, and sterile environments. For Anne, every pregnancy was a life-threatening event, and every birth was a lottery. The infant mortality rate in pre-modern Europe was staggering, estimated to be as high as 30–50% in the first year of life. Causes that are now minor or preventable were death sentences. Measles, which killed her son Charles Orland, was a common plague. Dysentery, influenza, smallpox, and simple infections could wipe out a nursery in days. There was no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or proper sanitation. A queen's chamber, though luxurious, was not sterile. Furthermore, genetic factors we can now screen for were invisible forces of fate. RH incompatibility between mother and fetus, for example, where the mother's immune system attacks the baby's red blood cells, can lead to successive miscarriages or stillbirths, a pattern tragically similar to Anne's reproductive history. While we cannot diagnose her from 5 centuries away, her string of losses points to an underlying biological tragedy that no amount of prayer or royal power could overcome. Beyond the fate of her children, consider the physiological toll on Anne's own body. She endured at least 7 documented pregnancies, and likely several more unrecorded miscarriages, in the span of about 20 years. Each pregnancy depletes the mother's body of essential nutrients like calcium and iron. The physical stress of gestation and childbirth, repeated over and over without adequate recovery time or modern medical support, would have been immense. Her reported bone ailments in her later years are entirely consistent with severe calcium deficiency or osteoporosis brought on by this relentless cycle. In essence, the demand for an heir was literally consuming her, breaking her down from the inside out. Her body, the political instrument of the French state, was being systematically destroyed by the very function it was required to perform. Finally, we must look through the lens of psychology. Anne was likely living with a form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. Her childhood was marked by war, the death of her father, and being forced into a marriage with her enemy. This initial trauma was not a single event, but a continuous state of being. Added to this was the relentless cycle of hope and devastating grief with each lost child. This creates a psychological state of learned helplessness, where a person begins to feel they have no control over their situation. Yet, paradoxically, Anne never gave in to helplessness. She fought back, which suggests a powerful internal conflict, a state of cognitive dissonance. She had to perform the role of the obedient French queen while her mind and soul fought for her identity as the Breton Duchess. This constant mental war, this need to compartmentalize her duties, her grief, and her political ambitions, must have been psychologically exhausting. Her insistence on her heart being returned to Brittany was not just a political statement. It was the final, desperate act of a woman trying to integrate a fractured identity and reclaim a piece of her soul. Anne's story forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question: what is power on the surface? She was one of the most powerful women in Europe. She was a duchess in her own right, twice a queen of France. She commanded wealth, led a court, and had the ear of kings. Her name was on treaties. Her face was on coins. Yet, was she truly powerful? Or was she merely an instrument, a conduit for a power that was wielded through her, but never by her? Her life suggests a chilling definition. Perhaps true power isn't the ability to act, but the ability to make others act according to your will. In that sense, Anne had status and influence, but the real power belonged to the men and the institutions, the French monarchy, the dynastic system, the patriarchy that dictated the fundamental terms of her existence. Compare her situation to that of another famous queen, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII of England. Like Anne, Catherine's worth was reduced to her womb. Her inability to produce a male heir led to a national crisis, her own personal humiliation, and ultimately, the English Reformation. Both women were pious, intelligent, and stubborn. Both were daughters of powerful monarchs, yet both discovered that their titles, their lineage, and their crowns were meaningless when they failed to fulfill their primary biological function as defined by men. Their stories are a grim parallel, demonstrating that across kingdoms and decades, the queen's body was the most vulnerable point in the entire political structure, a site of immense expectation and catastrophic failure. And this brings the question to you. Place yourself in the Château de Langeais in 1491. You are 14 years old. Your army is defeated. Your people are starving. The man who conquered you now stands before you, demanding your hand in marriage, offering a treaty that saves your people from immediate destruction, but signs away your personal freedom and your nation's long-term future. There is no help coming. There is no other option on the table. It is this, or the complete and violent annihilation of your homeland. What would you choose? Do you sacrifice yourself for a temporary peace, or do you let your country burn in the name of your own integrity? Is it better to be a living symbol of a subjugated nation, or a dead martyr for a lost cause? There is no easy answer. Let me know in the comments what path you would have chosen. Your answer reveals a great deal about your own philosophy of leadership, sacrifice, and survival. It is tempting to dismiss Anne's story as a relic of a brutal, medieval past, a sad tale of a distant queen in a world of kings and castles that has no bearing on our modern lives. But to do so is to miss the powerful and disturbing echoes of her struggle in the 21st century. The specifics have changed. We no longer trade duchies for marriage vows, but the fundamental themes of bodily autonomy, the political nature of a woman's body, and the fight for cultural identity against a homogenizing force are more relevant than ever. Anne's cage was built of stone walls and legal treaties, but modern cages can be constructed from societal expectations, economic pressures, and political ideologies. The most direct and potent parallel is the ongoing global conversation about female bodily autonomy. Anne's womb was, by law, an instrument of the state, its purpose dictated by the needs of the French crown. She had no legal right to refuse the pregnancies that ultimately destroyed her health. Today, the battle over who controls a woman's reproductive choices continues to be fought in parliaments, courtrooms, and on the streets. Debates over abortion access, contraception, and maternal health care are, at their core, about the same question that defined Anne's life: does a woman's body belong to her? Or is it subject to the control of the state, a religious institution, or a societal expectation? When a woman's right to choose is curtailed by legislation, she is, in a very real sense, being told that her body is not fully her own. It is an asset, a resource, or a vessel whose function can be decided by others. The ghost of Anne of Brittany stands silently behind every woman fighting for that fundamental right. Furthermore, consider the concept of the dynastic marriage in a modern context. While women in most of the world are no longer explicitly traded to prevent wars, the pressure to marry well remains a powerful social and economic force. Marriages can still be strategic mergers, uniting not kingdoms, but powerful families, corporate empires, or political dynasties. The pressure on individuals, particularly women, within certain social strata to partner with someone who will enhance the family's status, wealth, or influence is a modern echo of Anne's predicament. It prioritizes the collective, the family, the company, the party over the individual's personal happiness and freedom. This transactional view of relationships, where a person's value is tied to their strategic utility, is a direct descendant of the cold, political calculus that governed Anne's life. Finally, Anne's fiercest struggle was for the soul of Brittany, a fight for cultural survival. She used her court, her art, and her final will to preserve and honor Breton identity in the face of the overwhelming gravity of French culture. This is a story that repeats itself endlessly across the globe. Indigenous communities fighting to preserve their languages and traditions against encroaching modernity. Small nations struggling to maintain their sovereignty next to superpowers. Regional cultures striving to avoid being bleached into a bland, global monoculture. Every time someone fights to save a minority language, to practice a traditional craft, or to teach their children a history that is being written out of official textbooks, they are continuing Anne's work. The battle between the particular and the universal, the local and the global, is the great cultural drama of our time. Anne's last defiant act, sending her heart home, is a timeless symbol of the enduring power of belonging and the inextinguishable human need for a place to call home. In the end, how do we judge the life of Anne of Brittany by the standards of her time? She failed. She did not produce a male heir for France, and more importantly, for her. She failed to secure the lasting independence of her beloved Brittany. Her daughter Claude's marriage to Francis was the final act, and in 1532 the Duchy of Brittany was formally united with France. The story of the independent duchy was over. Anne's worst fears, the very outcome she was sacrificed to prevent and then sacrificed to achieve, had come to pass. A purely political reading of her life ends in tragedy and defeat. But history is more than just the cold ledger of wins and losses. To view her life only as a failure is to miss the staggering resilience of her spirit. She was a woman who was handed a losing hand from the moment of her birth, and yet played the game with ferocious intelligence and courage for her entire life. She navigated the treacherous courts of two kings, survived devastating personal losses, and never, ever stopped fighting for her people and her identity. She turned her court into a bastion of culture. She used her wealth to commission art that would outlive her. She wrote her defiance into her will. She may have lost the political war, but she won a victory for human dignity, refusing to be erased, refusing to be silent. Anne of Brittany's story is a testament to the fact that a life is not defined by its outcome, but by the courage of its struggle. She remains a potent symbol, not of victory, but of something far more human and far more enduring resilience. She is the patron saint of lost causes that refuse to die, the eternal symbol of a small nation's pride, and a haunting reminder that even within the most gilded of cages, the human heart will always, always fight to be free. If the story of this queen, trapped between her duty and her soul, has moved you, please subscribe to Dark History for more explorations into the shadows of the past. And let us know in the comments which other historical figure do you think fought the bravest battle against an impossible fate? We'll see you in the next chapter.